Hey everyone, welcome to The Final Four is Not on the Schedule. I'm your host Eric, alongside with expert analyst Rod. Thanks for joining us on the best MSU basketball podcast featuring in-depth recruiting, game matchup, and post-game analysis. We dive deep to give you the best tools to enjoy the Spartans and impress your friends and family. Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod with a bit of an unplanned episode. Our original plan this summer was to put out one episode a week with some cool interviews or maybe topics we don't have the time to get to during the season. Well, the Big Ten just can't help itself at the buffet table of other conferences and announced this week that it was taking a second helping for the Pac-12, or as of this recording, the Pac-4? I'm not quite sure. We still have a great interview coming out in a couple of days with Garrick Norman, but we're going to kind of squeeze this one in between. Before we begin, I'd like for you to consider leaving a written review on your podcast player. It helps the algorithms tremendously in getting other Spartan fans to find the show. As an added bonus, take a screenshot and shoot it to me at eric@tffinots.com. I can send you a $5 gift card to Nudge Printing. And TFF iNuts continues to grow thanks to word of mouth from you and continue to share with all your friends and family. So we'd like to thank you a ton. Okay, Rod. So right now, we're still sort of absorbing the news. The Big Ten is getting even bigger, adding Oregon and Washington, in addition to the previous Big Ten country of SoCal with USC and UCLA. And yes, we both understand that 100% of the conference expansion and alignment is due to football. It has nothing to do with any other sports. But this is a basketball podcast, so we're going to discuss what we think the impact will be on the Big Ten from a hoop standpoint. And so, aside from the general weirdness of the expansion outside the Midwest again, let's just start with Oregon and Washington. And why don't you just kind of go, I guess we'll just start with the basketball traditions for these two programs.
They make the Big Ten a deeper league. They're two schools that have some things going for them, but this is not, the last round where you were adding UCLA and USC. These two are much more akin to USC. UCLA's, from a basketball perspective, obviously a breed apart. That's a program that you can expect, and they will expect to contend with some regularity for Big Ten titles, unless they really screw it up. Oregon and Washington, I would put more in the USC category, which is, these are programs that, at least when they're operating near their best, should be able to think about consistently being NCAA tournament teams, but they're not often in the mix for deep runs in March, Final Fours, etc. Every once in a great while, it might happen. Oregon, I would say, has in recent terms a little more success than the other two, but not so much that you talk about them as a program. Let's put it this way. I think when UCLA joins, UCLA probably will deserve to be in a tier somewhere close to where Michigan State and Purdue are. I don't think that's true of these others. So will they improve the depth of the conference? Yes. Are they going to be real game changers in terms of the power structure in the league? I don't think so. And what's interesting about it is both, and let's restrict it to Washington and Oregon for this discussion. I think that both of them actually have the potential to be better than they've been, particularly Washington. The state of Washington over the last, say, 10, 15 years has become much, much better than it once was in terms of talent production. The city of Seattle produces a lot of players. The NBA Rookie of the Year, the reigning Rookie of the Year, Paolo Banchero of the Orlando Magic, and who did a year at Duke. He's a Seattle kid, and there are lots of others. It's really become a center of high-level basketball. And yet the University of Washington has not really been able to effectively parlay that into consistent results. I almost think of them as something, and it's not 100% on the money, but I do think the parallels are there. They're almost, in my mind, a West Coast version of Minnesota, in the sense that there's a lot of homegrown talent. And if they could just keep a heavy percentage of it at home, they would be a more consistently impactful program, and that they really should, particularly now, because not that Washington State was ever able to be a serious threat to Washington, but now that there's, Washington's going to be in the Big Ten and Washington State is going to be God knows where, a reconstituted Pac whatever, Mountain West. One of those two seems to be the most likely option.
ACC?
I'd bet against that, but yeah. Washington's going to have an even heavier advantage. The problem is Washington isn't always getting those kids to stay home at all, and Gonzaga's out there too, of course, but Gonzaga's program really isn't built on Washington kids so much. They may get one occasionally, but they're not really losing kids to Gonzaga so much. So for Washington, it'll be interesting to see if that changes. And I put a lot of that on coaching. They've just made some bad hires. That's the bottom line. Yeah. I mean, Lorenzo Romar was there forever, and he actually did a very good job recruiting. He just couldn't turn that into results. They have, and God, I can't believe I'm drawing a blank on his name. The guy who was Jim Boeheim's long-term assistant at Syracuse, Mike Hopkins. And Hopkins has also had some occasional success in recruiting. May remember he beat out Michigan State for Isaiah Stewart a few years ago. And he's occasionally managed to get highly rated kids since then, but he hasn't been able to put anything close to a winning program together. Oregon is a little bit of a different story because they have had some success. Ernie Kent had a run there for a while. And then more recently, Dana Altman has had some very good teams. Lately, the last couple of years, they've been in a little bit of a down period. It was interesting. Last year, Dana Altman called out the fan base for not supporting the program adequately. And that highlights the major issue with these programs relative to what you're used to as a Big Ten fan. Fans don't care as much. They just don't. The only one of these four programs we've added that cares about basketball as a fan base at a Big Ten kind of level is UCLA sometimes. Sometimes, not always. So that's going to be a little bit different, but
that's interesting because I wonder, is it being part of the Big Ten that changes this? Is it because they're large alumni base? Because I feel like, I guess I don't know how, I haven't looked to see how big Oregon or Washington are. I think they're pretty big schools, but they're nowhere near the size of the Big Ten, the Ohio States, Michigan States, Michigans. But I think they're probably at least on par with like a Nebraska or, Iowa.
I haven't looked into enrollment either, but I suspect you're right. They're big institutions. They're not quite as big. The Big Ten schools are the biggest, they're among the biggest in the country in enrollment terms,
right. Sure. Yeah.
But they're large. I would guess without looking at it that Washington and Oregon probably are somewhere between 30 and 40,000 students, probably somewhere in there, I would guess.
But I guess, you wonder why there's that difference in, I don't know, interest in, I guess, athletics. I mean, certainly there's a fan base around Oregon football and Washington football, and they have pretty decent traditions about schools now. I mean, Oregon more recently and Washington, more distantly, I guess, in the past. But there certainly isn't that, but there isn't that sort of collegiate interest in athletics in general for these schools. And and we talked about that with USC and UCLA. At least those schools, you're getting good traditions and success, at least one in football, one in basketball. But do you think that's something that's, because obviously California's its own thing, right? There's a million things to do in Southern California. Well, Portland, or I guess Eugene, there's not a whole lot going on. It's not like people can do stuff outdoors, but you could do lots of stuff outdoors in Michigan and, Minnesota, Wisconsin. It's not like it's any different. Do you think is it a cultural thing? Do you think it's because of the fact
I think it's that.
Because, people grew up and they're like the third or fourth generation who lives in whatever state, and people out the West Coast are generally newer transplants, either from, other countries or maybe from, the Midwest or the East Coast who kind of move out to the West Coast. I mean, I guess I don't know the answer to that. Maybe you'd have to talk to someone from there.
I think it's a couple of things. I think it's that some of it's cultural for sure, because even I hear what you're saying, but I would say generally speaking, and I'm basing this on the time I've spent in those states, which is as a visitor, not as a resident. There is more of an emphasis in a greater percentage of the population to outdoor activities than there is in Michigan or the Midwest as a whole. I think that's true. Now, I can't offer you proof of that. That's just my anecdotal impression, but I feel pretty confident saying that. So some of it is that. And then it just is, I just don't think the traditions are the same. I just don't think, and you can start, and that gets back to culture too, in a way, right? You can't delve in. Why do people in the South care so much more about collegiate athletics than they do in these other parts of the country? Well, the same thing happens here. I would say the West Coast is more similar to the East Coast in that way, in that it's not as simple as saying they don't care about sports, because both of those regions care a great deal about professional sports. Like I would never say the Bay Area is not a good sports market. It's a great sports market for professional sports. Fantastic. The Giants draw unbelievably well. The Warriors, obviously, in recent years have done very well. The 49ers are an obsession. But Stanford and Cal, it's just not there. Not on a level that would strike any non-Northwestern fan from the Big Ten region as normal. So, it's complicated, but I think there is some truth to it. Those programs are, I guess, going to have to hope that being part of the Big Ten, and maybe this is kind of a kick in the pants to kind of accelerate fan interest for a while, and then you hope that it just becomes habit. They're certainly not the worst in terms of their fan following. You pointed out that particularly in football, both schools have real traditions. And I think on the football side, they'll do pretty well on that front. Basketball is a different deal, though. These are not passionate basketball fan bases. They're just not. And they even fall, we can talk about, Big Ten schools that strike us as kind of middling at best in terms of the fan base support, the Michigans, the Ohio States, people like this. Those schools are much stronger than Oregon and Washington in terms of their fan bases. So, but, and the other thing is, which is an interesting dynamic with Oregon, is of course you have the Nike affiliation now part of the conference. So that'll be an interesting dynamic, I suppose, as well.
Well, we have some real recent evidence too. I mean, we talked about this last Thanksgiving tournament, which was out in the PK. It
was disgraceful.
Where, I mean, right. Like you said, there's not only was it Oregon, but Portland was out there as well. Now, Portland's not going to have a huge alumni base, I would imagine, but there was Michigan State fans were it seemed like at least 50%, if not more, of the fans, even against those teams. It was weird. You'd never expect that here.
Correct. And you could,
but that's just the nature of what
and to reiterate that discussion, granted the games were in Portland, they weren't in Eugene, but still, how many, I haven't seen the numbers, but I have to believe there's a heavy number of Oregon alums in Portland. There have to be. And it would just be like saying,
no one lives in Eugene.
It would be like saying, game in Detroit, you can't expect Michigan State fans to show up. What? That would be insane.
Right. Right. Or Des Moines. And people from Iowa City, that's not People aren't living
I
in
mean,
Iowa
we're
City
gonna
who are
look.
Iowa alum. They're all over the state of Iowa.
We're gonna see it. Michigan State's gonna play a game against Baylor at Little Caesars this winter. It's been announced in the non-conference. Michigan State does that regularly, usually against Oakland. This time it's a little bigger opponent, but they don't have any problems with attendance at those games. So yeah, that whole thing was illustrative of what we're talking about. That it is, but again, what's funny about it is that the Trailblazers have a very passionate fan base. So the NBA team, it's not that people don't care about basketball. It's that they don't seem to care a lot about Oregon basketball or Washington basketball. So those schools have some work to do, but on that front, but in terms of what they're going to be performance-wise in the Big Ten, again, I would say they make it deeper. You're certainly not adding, this is not adding Penn State or Nebraska. These schools will be better than they should be better than that. But how much better, we'll see.
I feel like at one point Michigan State played Washington in the NCAA tournament.
Long time ago, 1986.
Was that in the 80s
1986,
okay,
Scott Skiles. And that was really, in recent years, one of the high points of Washington basketball. They went through a period where they'd had Detlef Schrempf. They had a German connection. They had Detlef Schrempf, who was a very good player in college and in the NBA. And then he was gone for that game, but they had a 7-footer named Christian Velp, who was a very good player. But MSU took care of business in that game. That was a first-round win in the tournament.
Yeah, it was like 8-9 or something, or maybe it was 7-10 or
Michigan State was, I don't know whether they were 5 or 6, something like that. But they beat Washington, then they beat Georgetown the next game, and then lost to Kansas in that terrible clock gate, Sweet 16 game.
We already talked about that last summer.
Yeah,
so
but yeah, I mean, Washington really since then they've had some good players come through there, but not a lot of sustained team success. Oregon, as I say, I think they had one Final Four under Ernie Kent, I think, and Dana Altman's had some good teams there as well, but they just haven't had that, sustained run. And the other thing too is, let's be honest, they've been doing that in a Pac-10, Pac-12 that has not been particularly great over the last 20 some years.
Lots of wins available.
Yeah.
Right.
You basically, you've got UCLA more often than not is good, but they've had some weird periods too. Arizona has mostly been very, very good. And that's kind of about it. Periodically you might have a Stanford or a Cal go on a run for a few years, but we're not talking about a league that's been on the level of the Big Ten. And that's the thing. For as much crap as the Big Ten takes about no national champions since Michigan State in 2000, the Pac whatever is working on a streak 3 years older than that. Their last national title was Arizona in 1997.
Yeah, they've had some teams certainly in the final.
They have, but
but you're right. They have not, and in general, there have been many years where there've been like just two teams who make it. I mean, they've struggled to get more than one.
It's gotten worse,
which is crazy.
It's gotten worse in recent years. But I would say, from a basketball standpoint, if you were looking at the Pac-12, the 4 schools that the Big Ten has added are probably, I'm thinking about this, I would say right now, today, when you would say, what are they now? What could they be in the near term? You're probably talking about 4 of the top 5 in that conference the Big Ten has added. The Arizona would obviously be an outlier where they would be better than some of the teams, at least probably all of them except UCLA, maybe that the Big Ten added. But the Big Ten got, from a basketball perspective, which didn't drive this decision at all, it's just happenstance, the Big Ten got the better end of what was in that conference from a basketball perspective.
And maybe Utah
would be and they've had some success since then. Utah would be, and I was thinking about them actually, they would be the other one that would be in that conversation with some of these other schools. But comfortably 4 of the top 6. So they're definitely all
Right.
4 from the top half, I would say.
Well, and Utah is a recent addition to the Pac-10, 12, whatever. I mean, so that it's hard to sometimes even remember them as. And I don't even know if when Majerus was there, if they were in the
They weren't.
Pac-10. I don't think
They
they were.
weren't a Pac school. No, they
Yeah.
were.
So,
They were in the Mountain West at that point, I believe.
well, I guess let's talk about the overall sort of makeup. What's going to happen with the extra teams right after we talk briefly about nudge printing. As longtime listeners know, Nudge Printing, awesome work run by Gabe and Brittany, great Spartan alums, help with the Spartan Strong effort. They provide all our gear, which you can find at tffinots.com/merchandise. There you can find our hoodies and our t-shirts. We will once again this season, and it's actually coming up very soon, we'll have a contest again for predicting 1 through 14. It'll be really hard next year, 1 through 18. 1 through 14, the Big Ten standings. You can go up against Rod and me, and so whoever wins that gets a hoodie, can get some gear for the t-shirts, and so stay tuned for that. But Nudge Printing is where you get all that. And the neat thing about Nudge right now, if you go to nudgeprinting.com, not only can you get great Michigan State stuff, get stuff ready for tailgating, etc., but they have gotten rid of all the fancy models, and so they've redone their whole website. And they've got regular people like you and me who are posing for pictures. And so, because, Nudge Printing, the whole point of it is they're not, the Nike athletes. They're just like you and me, just regular folks, throw on a shirt, go to the bar to watch a game. That's what they are. That's who they are. And so that's what they've sort of rebranded their website. And so you can check it out at nudgeprinting.com. They've got all kinds of great products again, super comfortable, very wearable. They're the most popular shirts in my family. By far. I actually have to get more stuff because everyone wants, it gets dirty. They want another one. So people are stealing it from other people in our house. So we need to get more stuff. So they are great wearable shirts and super high quality, great value, free shipping. If you listen to the show, you can type in Final Four into the coupon code at checkout. You get 20% off your order. And again, like I mentioned, you can get a $5 certificate if you leave a written review, and you get an extra $5 that goes to Nudge Printing. Just send a screenshot to me at eric@tffinots.com. You won't regret it. Again, you can't have too much Nudge stuff. There's wonderful things. All right. So let's talk about in general, obviously this is a football decision. The league went from 16 games. We sort of just barely got used to that. We were joking about, SoCal being, Big Ten country, and now Puget Sound, I guess, or whatever. The entire West Coast now is pretty much Big Ten country, in addition to, Omaha. So what does this do? What happens now that there are 18 teams? What does that do for like a scheduling standpoint? How does this kind of change things within the conference? I mean, obviously nothing's been announced, and I think probably at this point, I think we can be comfortable in saying that we're just going to have that for 2024. I mean, I don't think they'll add another 2 teams that are going to change next year's schedule, but I guess we don't know for sure.
Well, it remains to be seen. Here's what we do know. I saw something from Andy Katz on Friday, I think it was. And Andy Katz, not only because he's a good reporter, has been for a long time, but he's also a Big Ten Network guy. I would take his information on this stuff very, very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
He said, well, his understanding is that they're going to stick with the 20-game schedule with the 18-team league.
Okay.
So that's interesting because I think there is reason to wonder, well, might they expand that again and go to 22 games?
Mm-hmm.
For now, it appears it's 20. So what does that mean? I've gone through this, and maybe somebody's got a different idea, but in my mind, the only way you can fit 17 teams into a 20-game schedule, which is this other 17 teams you're going to play, if we're sticking with the idea that you have to play everybody, which I'm assuming they are in basketball.
At least once, right?
Right. Yeah. It's going to mean 3 home and homes and 14 single plays.
Right.
So we are even further removed from any pretense of what used to be the way that the Big Ten functioned. For most of our listeners, for the majority of your life paying attention to Big Ten basketball, even in the 11-team Big Ten, you're playing most teams home and home. You had a handful of single plays, and yeah, there would be the occasional year where that might be significant as to who you played twice and who you played once. But for the most part, it was still close enough to the true round robin home and home with everybody that we grew up with, that you could really attach some value to winning the Big Ten regular season. We are now at a point where I think that's just out the window. I mean, you and I have talked about it on this podcast before, that what winning a Big Ten regular season title means has been devalued. And that was the case when they moved to a 14-team league. Now we're at 18, and you're talking about 3 dual plays and 14 single plays. Come on. There's just, I mean, schedule is going to, and there have been some instances where in the 14-team era which we've only had for 8 years, something like that.
Sure. Yeah. Sounds right.
I go back to 2016. I think most people during the course of that season understood that Michigan State was the best team in the league that year. They did not win the Big Ten regular season championship. Indiana did. And it was almost entirely down to scheduling difference. And I'm sure there's been another year. Well, we know the COVID year that was the case, but that was literally one team played fewer games and won it. But I won't dignify them by mentioning who it was, but I'm sure most of you know who I mean.
Now, certainly now they can guess.
Yeah. But now we're even further down that road. I mean, you're at a point where basically the home, who you're playing at home and who you're playing away, it's going to be more like football schedules, in terms of the importance. Well, we get Michigan at home this year. We've never thought about it in those terms in basketball, but that is where we are. But I think the bottom line is, even though guys like Izzo will never not care about winning the Big Ten, and even as a fan, I know if Michigan State is in position to win a Big Ten regular season title, I don't care who they've had to play to get there. I'm going to want them to win it. But how important it is, and maybe most of all, what it's going to mean in terms of representing the quality of your team vis-a-vis other teams in the league who played a very different schedule than you did, it's just not going to be that important. So that's something. There's been a lot, for whatever reason, and I think the reason is actually pretty obvious, because this round of expansion didn't just change the way some of these conferences look. It has resulted in quite possibly the complete elimination of a conference with unbelievable amounts of tradition and years behind it, right? The Pac 8, 10, 12 is probably going to be consigned to the dustbin of history. And if it's not, it's going to be a faint echo of itself in terms of what survives. But there's been a lot of hand-wringing around this. And I think that's the reason why. One of the things, I think there's some of that hand-wringing I think is misguided. We can talk about that in terms of what it might mean for other aspects of the sport, like the NCAA tournament, for example. Mm-hmm. But I do think if you are a basketball fan who cares about what happens between November and the beginning of March, what we call the regular season, this is not great, because it absolutely devalues anything you're playing for.
Right.
You can argue that what it might do is it might heighten the importance of the conference tournament. And we've talked about that here in the past too, that you can make an argument that as the Big Ten has continued to expand, the conference tournament has felt more important. But I would submit that's only been an occasional thing. Like, I don't know, you went last year. Did it feel to you that the Big Ten tournament was really important? Did that feel like there was a lot on the line?
No.
Yeah, I didn't think so either. Because Purdue had so clearly demonstrated that they were the best team that, but there have been years, Michigan State's been part of a couple of them where, there were a couple of teams at the top that you could flip a coin as to which one was better. And so those times it felt like the tournament really did mean something to the teams, to the fan bases, maybe even to NCAA tournament seeding, so it varies.
Yeah. I guess, the way I look at it too at this point is, I don't like it, but it's what it is and there's nothing you can do about it. And TV controls everything and football controls everything. And that's as dumb as you may think it is. It's just the reality of the situation. But when it comes to the regular season, you're going to be playing, it's going to be much more imbalanced. I think your season could swing by 2 or 3 games because you might get, Northwestern, Nebraska, Penn State, Minnesota and USC and Washington at home. And you might have play all the other teams, on the road. You could have a very unbalanced schedule, and it just by happenstance, you could have a really, really challenging, or vice versa, right? You could have a very easy schedule, and that's going to happen much more often. But I think, the one thing we can rest easily in the Big Ten as Big Ten fans and, certainly Michigan State fans, but you're not looking at a league that's going to be getting 2 bids, right? I mean, so this league is going to, if anything, is get more bids because you just kind of poached teams from other conferences. There's still only so many at-large bids, right? It has to. It has to happen. And so if that's the case, really all you're talking about is probably seeding, because you can have 30 teams in the league, but you're still going to have a pretty good feel from your non-conference schedule, whatever it is. And then within the conference, you're still going to have a pretty good idea who are the good teams or not. Now, is it going to affect your seeding? Instead of a 5, you might end up at 7 one year, or a 3 instead of a 5 because you just got an easier or harder schedule. I don't know. I mean, there's probably going to be some at the margins that probably makes a difference. But there's still going to be so many teams taken from the league that I don't think it's going to fundamentally change March in the sense that the NCAA tournament is going to feel the same. It will totally change the regular season. It's going to make it feel different if you win the Big Ten. It's going to be kind of like, what does that even mean anymore? But
right.
And I don't think the Big Ten tournament will change in the sense that it's not going to mean anything differently except, is this team 1 win away from making the NCAA tournament? Well, they're probably going to be 1 win away if when the conference is 14 teams or 10 teams. It doesn't matter. And so I don't think will make much difference,
One other way it might change is, does this mean that we start playing Big Ten tournament games on Monday?
Well, I mean, my wife and I are trying to figure that out. Like, how does the math work? Because one thing for sure is that every team is going to participate. There are some conferences, the smaller leagues, they may have the last teams that don't play, but
I don't think that's a lock. I think it's far more likely than not, but nobody said that yet.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine with the money involved in TV and the fan bases that you wouldn't have everybody there. Now, you're right. Maybe you have to come there. We're figuring out. I think you can play 4 games. Is it 4 games? Or is it 6 games a day? I think you play at most 6 games a day. I think that was usually sessions work. You have 2 sessions, or is it 4? I'm trying to remember now. I've worked this out. But you only play so many. You're just gonna have like 2 or 3 days worth of buys, depending where you are in the conference standing. So it'll change that part of this tournament. But ultimately, what really matters to people is March for most fans. And is it going to really change March a whole lot? That's, I guess, the next discussion, because that is like, is this going to make it more likely or less likely that you're going to expand the NCAA tournament field? Because I think you and I both, and most college basketball fans, feel that 64/68 is the perfect number. It's the amount of Cinderellas who are involved, but you don't have cruddy teams in there all the time, and just throwing any mid-major or any Power 5 conference team that barely had a winning record. You don't want to just throw at anybody. So I think you can still keep that magic without going to 128, or half the Division I basketball teams playing. So I don't think it changes that at all. And, that's something I know people are afraid of.
Yeah. So one element before we get into the heart of that issue is I do think, as we've been talking about, what these moves functionally do is they devalue even a bit more a regular season conference race, and championship. But what you can argue it further solidifies is the idea of this sport essentially being almost entirely about March. That everything before that is preamble. And that is, look, that is the reality in college basketball and has been for a long time. Romantics or people of a certain age attach value to things like conference tournament or conference championships and all of that. But, look at, there's a perfect example of this in the Big Ten at West Lafayette, Indiana, Matt Painter. Matt Painter is by any measure an extremely successful coach. But because of what's happened to that program in March, for most of his tenure, there's a feeling of underachievement around it, right? I mean, I think that's a fair statement. That illustrates perfectly the nature of the sport, of the way you are evaluated, of what fans care most about. It's that. So these kind of moves are, if on one end you're devaluing what happens in the regular season, that has to have a correlating effect of continuing to add more value around what your performance is in March,
Sure.
So that's where we're at. Now, the tournament, I saw a lot of apocalyptic hand-wringing in the media, way more than at any time, any previous realignment round. And again, I think most of that was because this was perceived to have killed the Pac-12. And so that's why there was one of the reasons why there was heightened emotion around this. But I saw some hand-wringing from college basketball media on Friday and Saturday that I really personally thought was histrionic and not accurate. And it centered around what you were just talking about. There seemed to be a feeling that this round of expansion, and I think also there's also in the background of this is a sense that Florida State really did its damnedest to give people this understanding that the ACC may not be for long, at least in its current form. But there seemed to be this sense that, well, this is just a way station toward an inevitable two things. One, an expansion of the tournament. But two, I think the bigger fear is something we have talked about previously on this podcast, which is that eventually the power conferences will break away and hold their own tournament, which will be a profound departure from the NCAA tournament that we know, because it would not feature anything but power conference schools. I don't think that's what this means. Could we get to that point at some stage? Yeah, you can't write anything off, but I don't sense it. And I feel that way for a couple of reasons. One, you remember when we had Jay Billis on, and listeners, if you haven't listened to that episode, I would suggest that you do. Because it spoke to a lot of this issue was one of the things that we touched on. And he had an interesting point I hadn't really heard anybody articulate before that made sense to me intuitively. Because what we were talking about was, well, it does seem like an inevitability that the power schools are going to break free of the NCAA rubric and form their own entity. And it makes sense for a lot of reasons. It makes sense financially. It makes sense because they don't want to be subjected to being part of an organization where their vote is the equivalent to a 1,500 student liberal arts school in the middle of Iowa. And they both votes carry the same weight.
Right.
Even though both schools have massively different circumstances, priorities, etc. All makes perfect sense. It also, by the way, would, I think, free the power schools up to do some of the other things we talked about with Jay that I think are going to be a necessity sooner or later, which means things like moving to an employee model for where athletes are compensated directly, contracts, which will impact things like the portal, which is driving everybody crazy, all of these kinds of things, right? But the concern from a basketball point of view is, okay, if that happens, what does that mean for the NCAA tournament? Does that mean that these schools aren't NCAA? Michigan State's not an NCAA school anymore. So what does that mean? And Jay pointed out, he said, well, look, there's nothing that's preventing those schools getting together with the NCAA schools and holding their own tournament where everybody is eligible to be invited to it, which would be a status quo essentially. So that's one thing. And intuitively that made a lot of sense to me. Now, there are other complications that we can't solve here today, which is, okay, if they pull out, does that mean those schools will still schedule NCAA member schools? Will they play mid-majors, during the regular season? And if they don't, how do you evaluate those teams vis-a-vis each other? And, there are complications, but I suspect that would happen. The other possibility is that these power institutions pull out just for college football. And that's a distinct possibility too, that's where we go, right? And so they never really leave the umbrella of the NCAA in terms of basketball or any other sports, So I think that's one thing to keep in mind if you're worried about this. The other thing, and this gets not only at that issue I was just talking about, but also at the idea of expanding the tournament. We have and I know a lot of our listeners are also members of the Spartan Mag Board. And there's a poster I think we've referenced on here before a few times, Atlanta 12, who is, I believe, my understanding, is involved on the television advertising side of collegiate sports, which is a very good place to be because it makes you privy to a lot of conversations about these issues. And, for those who, it's become a very popular thing over the last 72 hours or so to say, well, the Big Ten didn't make the decision to expand, Fox did. Okay, maybe there's some truth in that, but I think you could also say the people who advertise on Fox have a lot to say about this, right? Because they're ultimately the ones that are buying the product. So someone in that position has reason to know a lot, and he's been very, very good in terms of forecasting what was coming. And one of the things he's had to say about this issue of expanding the tournament is he said, not only is it an expensive proposition to be an advertiser in the NCAA basketball tournament, but it's a tough proposition to even be able to get into that position. In other words, it takes some work just to become an NCAA tournament sponsor, advertiser, what have you. And the understanding is that those people, and I believe most of the decision makers in the college basketball world, meaning athletic directors, et cetera, also understand this as well, that there is an understanding of what makes the tournament successful and what might chip away against the reasons that it works. It is a phenomenally successful event. We all know that. From a ratings perspective, an interest perspective, an advertising rate perspective, all of these things.
Gambling.
So
Yeah.
if you believe all of that, then you have to believe that saner minds prevail and understand, hey, the wider we broaden access to this event, and especially if we're in the process of doing this, also making it less likely that we have those kind of Fairleigh Dickinson over Purdue moments that capture the imagination so well, the less interest there's likely to be, and the less valuable your property is going to be. So I am not worried about some kind of massive expansion, and I'm not really worried about the tournament anytime in the near term, at least, becoming a big schools only kind of thing. I think everybody involved understands the reason the NCAA tournament works is in part the idea that you can have these Davids versus Goliaths have success. It captures the imagination of the country when that happens. And that's what gives the event juice, you know? And if you get rid of that aspect of it, yeah, you've still got a championship and you still have interest, but it's not the same thing.
Right. Yeah. If you have Baylor as the 3 and Washington as the 14, no one gets that excited about Washington winning that game.
No, you don't want to. And that's the other thing too, is even from a competitiveness standpoint, I would submit part of the reason that you see upsets happen in the NCAA tournament is you have to remember the team who wins, the Southland Conference, or they win, the Ohio Valley, whatever league it is. Now, sometimes you have a team like Fairleigh Dickinson was an example where they really weren't great even within their league. They just happen to get hot in their conference tournament. And that does happen a few leagues a year. But for the most part, those teams have been very successful. What that means is those teams have a confidence about them and that they've earned through winning, and they've learned how to win. That, I think, helps those kinds of upsets happen. If you've got a 14-seeded Washington team that was 13-16 in the season, and they finished 15th in the Big Ten, is that team really? I know they objectively have better talent than a mid-major champion, or they might. But are they actually going to be more likely to pull off an upset? I would submit maybe not.
Yep.
That's just an opinion, but I do think there's some merit to it.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think, when you look at, and as far as, are these big Power 5 conference teams going to be playing schools that are in the, mid-majors or whatever, unless these schools want to only play Power 5 schools all season, which they don't seem to have any appetite to do right now, which they could do, right? There's nothing stopping them right now. There's no reason to think that they wouldn't continue playing those teams and opportunities for those teams to be part of the mix and at least the non-conference schedule too, right? So in some ways, I don't think it really changes a whole lot, except that you're going to be playing teams more routinely that you never did before. But again, it doesn't change, I guess, the overall nature, probably like the balance of your schedule. I don't think a whole lot.
Well, the only way that we start to get into that equation is if the Big Ten looks at this and decides, you know what, this 3 dual plays and 14 single plays is just not good. We got to at least get that to, I don't know, 5 and 12.
Yeah.
Right. And then that would necessitate a 22 game schedule. Now, I don't think there's any way. Whereas I do think in football, I'm going to kind of be surprised if football doesn't add another game or two at some point to the regular season. Because, growing up, it was 11 games and then it's become 12. 12 has become codified and, can actually be 13 if you're playing in a conference championship and as many as 15 if you get all the way to the playoff title game. I think they can do that. Basketball, I just don't know if there's room on the schedule to add
unless you
more
start
games.
compressing time between games.
But
like
that's
that,
the thing. I think you'd have too much pushback.
Yeah, no, I think
so if the Big Ten were to move to a 22 game conference schedule, well, that's now meaning you've maybe got 7 or 8 non-conference games tops. And you are starting to restrict some of this stuff. Now, the downside to that is, there's always been an understanding that you have the non-conference, a certain number of games at least, to work through kinks, play around with playing groups, basically fine tune your team before it gets serious. Well, there's going to be less and less of an opportunity to do that. On the flip side, if what you're interested in primarily is the most competitive possible scenario, playing 22 games against Big Ten opponents will be very competitive. I can tell you that much. So there won't be many nights where you go into it thinking, well, we got a laugher here, under that scenario. So it'll be interesting to me to see how they play that out. I will say this. The idea of this 3 dual play, 3 home and home and 14 single plays, I personally am not a fan of that. I don't like it. I don't see another way around it, but I don't like it.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's probably the case too. So if you're one of the 4 remaining teams of the Pac-12, the Pac-4, life's in the gutters. Well, if your life's in the gutter and you're having trouble with your gutters, your house, you need to reach out to the brothers at Just Do Gutters. They do fantastic work. It seems like monsoon season all the time now here in Michigan. Some place in the country, like out in Arizona, former Pac-12 country, they have searing heat. Well, we've had a lot of rain here, especially last month or so. If you're having trouble with your gutters, leaves build up in the fall or the spring, and you hate climbing up your ladder, maybe you don't like climbing on ladders like me, especially if it's like 2 stories up. You've taken care of too many people who've fallen off ladders and broken their neck or ankles and arms and stuff. So get the professionals to do it. They do a fantastic job, fully insured, take care of everything. They can put the leaf guards in, they can clean them out, they can replace them, which they had to do for mine. I had a tree growing my gutter. Don't be like me. Don't leave your gutters in such poor condition that you end up causing all kinds of problems around your house. It is important, just like having good roof and shingles, you have to have good gutters to keep the water off your house. So contact the brothers at Just Do Gutters. There's Kurt over on the west side of the state and his team, and there's also Greg and his team on the southeast side of the state, Metro Detroit area, which is a very large region. You're just kind of out of luck if you're in the north part of the state or in Lansing area, or if you're not even in Michigan. I don't know what to tell you, but if you're in Michigan, you want to contact these guys. They do fantastic work. You can find them at brothersgutters.com. You can also find links to that in the show notes below or on YouTube if that's where you're watching this as well. And again, 10% off if you say Final Four for your estimate. So finally, I guess the last question, I guess my impression here is that you're not a big fan of the expansion, but it is what it is. From a Michigan State standpoint, does this really affect much? Because I feel like, I guess for me personally, as a season ticket holder, I'm going to be, potentially it could be great if you get the right teams scheduled, but you could also have a lousy season, like I said, where you're getting Northwestern and Penn State and Nebraska, and you're not getting any good games, which is entirely possible.
It's going to be a lot more like football, right? Where every year we look at that home slate for football and it can vary quite a bit, right?
Yeah. Right. And so anyway, I think there's going to be that aspect of it, but for Michigan State, I don't feel like it's going to make much of it because again, Tom Izzo, and I don't know if this is an insight really by him, but I definitely feel like he recognized early on in his career that there's a greater and greater emphasis on what happens in March. And he sort of would build his program and his season to crescendo sort of at that time. And not to say that Judd Heathcote didn't do that, but I feel like it just became, he recognized that sort of the trend, as you mentioned, it's just that's become more and more about March. And so I think in some ways it doesn't really make a difference too much for Michigan State, except that, I'm not going to be traveling to, Eugene to go watch a game or anything like that. And maybe the Big Ten tournament's not going to be in Las Vegas. Who knows where they have to evenally have it out west at some point, probably, right?
Rule it out. Sure.
Something like that.
They did it for DC and New York. So you would think somewhere on the West Coast.
Sure. I mean, they're like 24 Rutgers fans who made that game, and I'm sure the 24,
it's an interesting point because clearly, that's Izzo's reputation, and I think even Michigan State fans believe that he kind of has this internal clock that moves from November to March and is calibrated in such a way that the team is peaking in March. And I would say, the last 3 years, which by Izzo standards have not been great, you could make a pretty good argument that Michigan State was playing its best basketball of the season in March in all 3 of those years. So it is definitely a truism. On the other hand, I know that things like winning Big Ten championships means a ton to that guy. He will never, because of the age he's at, he's never going to get to a point, no matter what they do with the schedule, that he's going to say, well, this doesn't really matter. That's just never going to happen. I think in terms of what it means for Michigan State as a program, I agree. It doesn't mean very much in this sense. If you were talking about if Kansas had joined the Big Ten, let's say, you could make an argument, well, that's another heavyweight and maybe one of the handful of programs anywhere that you could say on a year in, year out basis might be a little better positioned than Michigan State, right?
Right.
There's not many of them. That's one. They didn't add anybody like that. So, and even as we've said, UCLA, for as much tradition as there is, and I expect them to be a very, very good basketball program over time in the Big Ten. Right now, at least, and really for the entirety of Tom Izzo's tenure at Michigan State, it's never felt to me like UCLA was a Kansas, Duke, Kentucky, Carolina, where you could make an argument, well, if that program is humming on all cylinders, you might not be able to do anything about it, even if you're as great as Michigan State is. UCLA is not that. So this wave of expansion doesn't change very much. I think that for the last 25 years, Michigan State is the preeminent basketball program in the Big Ten. I don't think there's much of an argument about that. And I don't expect that to stop unless and until Tom Izzo is not the head coach. And then we'll see. So, yeah, this doesn't change anything in terms of the real fundamentals of MSU.
Well, I think we'll leave it there. Again, if you have always wondered, hey, how can I support the show aside from sharing it with your friends, leaving a 5-star written review on your podcast player? If you want to become a paid supporter of the show, or you have a business you want to advertise on our show, we're more than happy to have you come on board. You can go to find out more about that at tffinots.com/support. There you can find ways of giving a one-time gift via PayPal or Venmo, or a monthly subscription through Patreon. Also, you can get a hold of me and send me a letter anytime, eric@tffinots.com. Actually, it's interesting. I don't even know if I told you this. We had Patrick, one of the listeners who dropped an email saying, we had done a show earlier, we were talking about the 5 greatest wins for Michigan State in the NCAA tournament. And he said, well, you got to have one that's the 5 worst. I think myself, I don't need to relive those moments. And so I think I appreciate the thoughts, but I don't know about you, but I don't need to relive those painful losses anymore. Talk about Middle Tennessee State and what went wrong. So, I do encourage you, though, if you have ideas for shows, please send them along. We're more than happy to do it, especially when you have a little more time during the summer. So shoot them along to me. And anytime we hear from people, I really appreciate it a ton. And if you see us out and about, say hi. I appreciate that, too. So until next time, the Final Four is on the schedule. Go Green.
Thank you.